What's going on, people? My name is Batman, and I thought it would be worthwhile to compare the latest installment of Battlefield with the latest installment of Call of Duty. For one, to help some of you decide which game is best for you, but also because this is probably the most competitive matchup in the shooter genre right now, with Battlefield aggressively trying to cut into COD's market share, and COD fighting tooth and nail to retain its #1 spot, and this matchup says a lot about the current state of the shooter genre, and to a lesser extent, AAA gaming titles in general. And more importantly, it can foreshadow a lot of what's to come in future FPS games, starting with the next round of big releases due at the end of this year. I believe it begins with Halo 5 on October 27th, going through the end of November and maybe early December. These are the two leaders of the FPS genre. They can tell us a lot about where the genre itself is headed and whether or not we're going to like that direction. Battlefield Hardline, in terms of its gameplay and appeal, is the closest to a traditional Call of Duty formula that any Battlefield game has ever been. And somewhat ironically, at the same time, Advanced Warfare is the farthest from that original formula that a COD game has ever been. And the result is that these games actually have a lot in common, even if at first glance they seem entirely different. Now, typically when we compare video games, we look at more standard stuff like graphics, sound effects, replay value, core game mechanics, etc., etc. But I think using these indicators to determine which game is superior is a flawed approach, because I can tell you right now, Battlefield takes the trophy home in each of these categories. It's got much more depth and replay value. For every attachment in COD, there's at least 2 or 3 versions of it in Battlefield. Battlefield classes and their capabilities and the kinds of gameplay they offer are much more unique and diverse. You know, in every single COD match you play, you're going to thrust around the map and shoot at bad guys and get shot at, with the biggest difference in terms of the gameplay itself, in terms of the gameplay experience itself. From one map or one game mode to the next, the biggest difference is usually the distance at which your gunfights are taking place. Other than the layout of the maps, not a lot changes, and there aren't a lot of different ways you can play each map. There aren't a lot of different ways to experience the multiplayer in Call of Duty. In Battlefield, you have a much more interesting set of options. Do you spend the match as a transport heli pilot, dropping off teammates at advantageous locations? Do you spend it as a gunner and a repairman in that same heli? You're getting shot at, taking rockets, you're repairing, you're fighting off, you're dropping your friends off at key locations. It's its own kind of experience, as opposed to just typical infantry fighting. Do you spend it sniping from the top of skyscrapers or hanging out the window of a sedan with a shotty doing drive-bys? Do you get in the attack heli, which is distinctly different from the transport heli, and spend the match as DPS on the bad guys, and you get disabled and your heli crashes into the side of a building, you have to abandon it and parachute to the ground, and you're taking sniper fires, you float to the ground, so you try to maneuver around in your parachute so the sniper can't hit you, and you land in the middle of an intense firefight on the bridge that is at the center of some Levolution event, with each Levolution event being different on each map? Are you running around in the oil tanker, racking up hot wire points? Are you playing as a medic, running around in a police car that you're pretending is an ambulance, and you pull up next to every dead teammate and revive them and then get back in your car and escape into the night? Or even if you're playing as a standard infantry running gun, the difference of the experience between using an SMG and an LMG in Battlefield requires you to significantly change your playstyle, whereas in COD, switching to the LMG from the SMG won't dramatically change your playstyle, because there isn't a lot of room to change your playstyle. Because the map is so small and everyone is able to move around it so easily and quickly. You're still basically going to have to play the same way unless you significantly nerf yourself. Like, there isn't really a way to, hold down a particular choke point or area with the LMG in Advanced Warfare. You're still basically going to have to play the same way. Maybe you sprint around less. But the traditional LMG playstyle doesn't work. In fact, it hasn't worked in COD in a while. That's why you don't see a lot of people using LMGs. To make the LMG work, you actually have to adapt it to the generic uniform playstyle that has to be used in Call of Duty. You have to put like a quick draw or a stock on it, or something along those lines, to make it actually a consistent, viable option. But then when you do that, it just turns the LMG into an AR with a massive magazine, basically. It does very little to change the actual gameplay experience, right? And that's true for, SMG to assault rifle, to a lesser extent even from assault rifle to a sniper rifle. The whole quick scoping thing in Call of Duty, the reason quick scoping evolved in Call of Duty is because regular sniping hasn't ever really been an option in Call of Duty. I mean, it kind of was at some points on some maps, in like maybe Black Ops 1 and MW2, but hard scoping, what would be called hard scoping in Call of Duty, is not a typical, viable, consistently successful option. Snipers had to evolve into quick scoping because they had to make the sniper work for the generic uniform playstyle that you have to use in basically every Call of Duty match all the time. there isn't a lot of room to change the way you are playing. There isn't a lot of room to change the experience. With the right attachments equipped, every weapon in COD can be played as every other weapon in COD, and that's just because the beauty of COD, the appeal of it, has always been in its simplicity. That's the thing. You think I'm criticizing COD right now. For some of you, I probably am. For myself, it's a criticism, but the truth is, it's a huge part of the appeal. It's why it sells so well, is the simplicity. But like I've said a lot in the past, to achieve that simplicity, to a certain extent, a game's depth and replay value has to be sacrificed. But in terms of depth and replay value, Battlefield wins out and has always won out. It's got much better sound across the board, whether it's the guns or explosions or the fucking water splashing. The graphics aren't night and day better like it was with Battlefield 4 compared to Ghost, but ultimately, Hardline is able to put much more detail into their environment. And they can feature a much wider array of, like intense explosions and destruction sequences, and can put a lot more stuff on your screen at once while retaining that 60 frames per second. Whereas for COD to maintain that same 60 frames per second, it has to seriously restrict how much stuff is happening on your screen at any given time. It can't really make the most of highly detailed explosions or stuff like that. The most it can usually do is a scripted moving piece of its environment. When you see a Call of Duty score streak get shot down out of the air, the explosion, the destruction of that thing, it's very cartoon looking. You know what I mean? It's very awkward and cartoony and sort of blocky, and the pieces like disappear before they hit the ground because they can only do so much before they start losing frames. And that just comes down to the nature of the game's engines. I mean, Frostbite 2.0 really is a next-gen engine with next-gen capabilities. It couldn't even run properly on the old-gen consoles. Well, COD's engine is as old as the 360. They say it's new every year, but that's just because they've modified it or rebuilt it from scrap. It's sort of like double speak, but it still has the same limitations year in and year out. And until they make significant technological progress, COD will always be on the bottom tier of quality regarding its graphics and sounds and anything technological like that. And yet, even with those limitations, even when it has been clearly outplayed in many categories by many games, it has retained that top spot. And this tells us that those measurements that I just talked about don't really matter, because they really don't. Now, as far as the fundamental game mechanics go between Hardline and Advanced Warfare, depending on the person, Advanced Warfare's exosuit and killstreaks may win out over Hardline's destruction and vehicular gameplay. I won't deny that thrusting around with reckless abandon in that exosuit and squashing pathetic ants from the sky in your chopper gunner can be addicting, and this year Hardline sort of limited the quality and quantity of both its destruction and vehicular mechanics. If this was Battlefield 4, I would say that Battlefield 4's vehicular depth and fully destructible environments with evolution, putting it all on steroids, those mechanics took the win over the exosuit and killstreaks. But with Hardline, it's something closer to a draw for me personally, and I'd imagine a wash generally with the FPS audience at large. Now, interesting, unique, and fun game mechanics do matter, and what this commentary is really about is the fine line both these games are trying to walk in being able to provide interesting game mechanics and the subsequent depth and replay value those mechanics offer, without taking away from the measurement that matters most in any shooter game as far as attracting and retaining customers goes, which is its simplicity and what that simplicity provides. The most significant factor which will determine a game's level of success or failure is how many kills per minute a typical player is getting, period. It matters more than game sounds and the game's graphics and the replay value and the depth of its mechanics, and the ultimate tragedy, like I said, is that replay value and depth have to be sacrificed and nerfed in order to provide the simplicity that buffs the kills per minute of every player across the board. So I want to talk about the very similar steps that each of these games has taken to sacrifice what I would consider a game's overall level of quality in order to compress the skill gap and boost the one metric that matters most in determining a game's sales, which is of course how often they feel like a badass motherfucker, because it's a trend. In terms of sales and popularity, these are the top two shooter franchises on the market right now. If they're doing it, other games will follow suit, and they already are, and it's sapping the overall quality of the shooter genre that I and so many of you love. Now, the first key step to compressing the skill gap is lowering the time to kill. And listen to me very carefully. The only tangible in-game result of lowering the time to kill in any game is that gun skill and intelligent class setups matter less and less. When the time to kill is as low as it is in both Advanced Warfare and Hardline, your gunfighting skill matters less. Your ability to manage recoil matters less. Burst firing matters less. Your aim in general matters less. Headshots matter less. Actually, they don't matter at all in either of these games anymore. Your reaction times matter less. And worst of all, the gun you are using and the creative ways you have decided to customize your class matter less and less. If we look at Battlefield 4, or past battlefields like Bad Company and such, which had much higher times to kill than we have now with Hardline. Your gunfighting abilities mattered. If you shoot at someone but failed to properly manage the recoil, if you were at a range at which your gun isn't properly suited for. For instance, oftentimes I see Battlefield players trying to use their SMG at AR ranges. You may get the first shot off, but if you fail to land enough bullets due to poor recoil management against a moving target, because the other guy started strafing back and forth once he realized he was under attack and he realizes he's getting shot at and he turns on you with an AR and manages his recoil better, you can lose that gunfight even though you saw him first and you shot at him first, because once the gunfight started, your actual gun skill and the gun skill of your opponent had an impact on the outcome of the gunfight itself, which is kind of how it's supposed to be. If you shoot at a guy and he's near cover, or only has a part of him sticking out from that piece of cover, if he's clipping or head glitching and you don't have any cover and you shoot at him, he's going to turn on you and kill you because you made a gunfighting mistake. If you and opponent both see each other and you're both behind pieces of cover, it's going to come down to your gunfighting ability and what role that plays in determining who wins. And that's not to say that those scenarios never happen, period, in Hardline, because Hardline's TTK isn't as low as Call of Duty's, but they happen less and less in Hardline. Your gunfighting abilities matter less and less in Hardline. You get punished less for gunfighting mistakes, which means you benefit less from gunfighting properly without making mistakes. Now in Advanced Warfare, with the TTK as low as it is, those things don't happen, period. Gunfighting ability hardly ever matters, and the vast majority of kills in that game are decided by who saw who first. If you look at that video I made on how to get better at Advanced Warfare, pretty much that whole video revolves around the idea that you need to ADS on your opponent before your opponent ADSs on you, because I know that whoever ADSs first will win the gunfight pretty much every time. And like I said, your class customization options matter less and less too. When the TTK is so low, you're able to use an SMG like an AR and vice versa, because the recoil and damage drop off of the SMG don't matter as much because you don't have to land nearly as many bullets, and the slower ADS and wider hipfire spread of the AR matter less at close quarters because you don't have to land nearly as many bullets. You can miss more bullets. The difference between damage ratios in certain guns matters less. And again, it's not that it doesn't matter at all in Hardline, but it matters a lot less than it did in Battlefield 4 because of the lower TTK. In Battlefield 4, if I walk into a room with a shotty and you have an SMG and we're both at full health, I'll win that gunfight every time because I can usually fire that shotty at least twice in the time it takes you to kill me. Now in Hardline, the shotty still has the advantage, but much less of an advantage because the SMG TTK is only slightly longer than the time it takes me to pump the shotty into you just once. And then in Advanced Warfare, what gun you're using barely matters, and never matters more than who saw who first. And that's why in almost every COD game you see sort of one gun emerge as the go-to gun, because what it really comes down to is ease of use. Because the TTK in Call of Duty is so low, you can use the BAL-27 as an SMG, shotgun, AR, and sniper rifle. You know what I mean? The lower the TTK is, the less difference there's going to be between using different guns. All that matters in Call of Duty is who saw who first. If we're at a long range and you have an AR and I have an ASM-1, and I see you first, even though I have an SMG, and you're supposed to have the advantage, I'll probably still win. And so, like I said, because every gun can be used in every situation, intelligent class design, weapon setups, and strategic movement and tactical positioning based around the weapon you chose and the class you set up barely matter anymore. Because at the end of the day, if we walk into a close quarters room and I have a BAL-27 or a sniper rifle and you have a shotgun, there's still a very high chance that I win the fight. And again, other games are following suit. If you look at Halo 3, if you start shooting at someone with an AR or a BR or whatever, they have the opportunity to turn on you. If they can aim better and land more headshots, they'll win, even if you got the first shot, or maybe they have a weapon better suited to the range. If you come at them with a BR and they have dual SMGs, for instance, maybe you start shooting at them with the BR, they have dual SMGs, so they get behind a piece of cover and you have to pursue them behind the piece of cover, but once you approach their piece of cover, you're in the range where the dual SMGs have the advantage, so they can come out, and it's kind of like a chess game, it's like a back and forth strategic positioning chess game. Or maybe they have a piece of equipment that changes the fight, like a power drain or a bubble shield. They can throw a grenade at your feet, get a good grenade bounce. It's an actual gunfight. It's an actual battle. There's an opportunity for strategy and tactical, creative, problem-solving, critical thinking to make a difference. But that's not how it was in Halo 5. In Halo 5, the TTK was so low that more often than not, if it stays that low, what it's going to come down to in Halo 5 is who saw who first. That's going to play a much bigger role than it ever has in a Halo game, and it's going to play a much bigger role than your gunfighting abilities or whatever. It's going to come down to who saw who first. Now, once you've lowered the TTK enough so that what matters more than any individual player's skill is who saw who first, you need to set up your map design in a way that allows every player the opportunity to see other players first, even if they don't have much talent in locating the enemy without being located first themselves consistently. Because even when the TTK is low, there is still a significant skill gap between players who are really good at finding the enemy, at knowing where the enemy will be and when they will be there, and tactically positioning themselves to take advantage of that situation. In the past, in games like COD 4 and World at War and even MW2 to a lesser extent, that's where the skill gap was. Tactical positioning, understanding which areas are high traffic, where a map's choke points are, understanding spawns and what general direction the enemy will be, using the mini-map to extrapolate enemies' positions and try to predict where they might be and when, and understanding where you should not be and at what times you should not be there. Understanding the specific positions on a map that have the right cover at the right angle to serve as a power point for a certain slice of map control. Understanding where power points' vulnerabilities are, how to counter certain power points, how to counter the counters to those power points. That strategic element is being gradually phased out of games. It has had its significance reduced in Hardline when compared to past Battlefields, and it doesn't even exist in Advanced Warfare. Now, professional video game level designers typically have an idea of what kind of gunfights they want to see play out in the multiplayer maps they design. Right, they don't just randomly build some area and hope that it's fun to play on. They know what kind of battles will play out, how players will follow through the map, where the choke points are and such. So if we look at a map like the fan favorite Terminal from MW2, we can get an idea of what kind of gunfights the level designers wanted to see play out. We know that this, air conditioner silver box thing on the corner of the big ass oil tanker building was a strong power point for anyone who wanted to head glitch it, but it was extremely vulnerable to the flanks from the room behind it, the end of the hallway off to its right, and if it wasn't paying attention, someone could get it from the cockpit. And the plane's cockpit was a great vantage point to cover this entire hallway, but it was penetrable, so you couldn't stay there long. The rest of the plane could cover the tarmac very well, but it was vulnerable to the very back of the plane, where motherfuckers could sneak up the ladder. On top of the oil tanker building was a great way to cover 50% of the map at any given time, but to cover that 50% of the map, you usually had to expose yourself to the other 50% of the map. You have this piece of cover up here that was a great way to fend off anyone trying to come up the escalators on the C flag here, but it was vulnerable to a flank from the bookstore. You could get to the top of the escalators and rain down on anyone trying to come up the escalators, but then they could go up the ladder around the side of the oil tanker building and take you out from above or the flank very easily. So it was a very fun map layout that consisted of strong power points that were very vulnerable to any number of flanks, and that's how they wanted the map to play out. A consistent flow of people assuming power positions, of those power positions getting countered, and then the counters to those power positions getting countered in turn, sort of a cyclical thing. And success was determined by a player's ability to manage those intelligently. But the problem with this, from their point of view, is that a lot of people didn't catch on to the larger strategic layout of the map. They didn't understand how to counter the power points and didn't understand what to watch out for when they were commanding a power point. They didn't even know what the fuck a power point was. So there was a skill gap and a learning curve there that many players struggled with. And you can go look at any MW2 map, Afghan, Rundown, Subbase, and if you think about it, you know where the power points are, what pieces of map those power points control, and where those power points are vulnerable from. It's this really interesting chess game that allows room for creative strategies and rewards critical thought. Now, some people might say the only reason MW2 had this consistent type of tactical positioning based map layouts is because it was a camper's game, which it kind of was, but even in Black Ops 1, which I think most people consider a Russian-friendly game, you still had positions like Pride Rock on Jungle, you had the map Array, where you could basically control the entire map from the middle building, and so it was a really interesting dynamic where if you could defend yourself in that building, you could control the whole map, so you had to attack that building to attack anything on the map consistently successfully, and then you have that tall-ass sniper tower, which could wreak havoc on motherfuckers in the building. It was a chess game. You got maps like Firing Range, which had a number of interesting power positions like this, and this one here, and that one, all of which have their own vulnerable flanks, right? That huge tall tower. But this kind of layout has been gradually phased out over the course of the last 3 CODs. We see less and less intricately designed and interlocking power points and flanking routes, and instead, most of the power points in COD nowadays are often as vulnerable to the area they are overlooking, controlling, as that area is to them from their PowerPoint. The result is that it doesn't really matter who chooses their PowerPoints more intelligently, it just matters who gets where first, who sees who first. And really, that's mostly random, especially when you take into account how random the spawns can be. So if we look at a map like Solar from Advanced Warfare, there are 0 power points on this map, and because of the exosuit, everything is a potential flanking route. Map control basically does not exist. Every elevated position is wide open and has little to no advantage over the guy shooting at you from ground level, especially because the bad guy can use his exosuit to counter any advantage an elevated position might have. Every elevated position is wide open and completely vulnerable to every other elevated position. That tactical skill-based dynamic doesn't exist anymore. There are no power points, there are no strategic flanking routes. Everyone can go in any direction at any time. And the map is so symmetrical that any given side of any piece of cover isn't going to have an advantage over the other side of that piece of cover. So the gameplay itself essentially revolves around thrusting around the map and trying to see people before they see you, and perhaps finding somewhere to hide while you reload, but there's very little room for player skill to make a difference. There's no more clipping or head glitching. You don't really use cover in a gunfight anymore. Every gunfight takes place typically between 2 fully exposed combatants, and it just matters who saw who first. The only way the skill gap could possibly get smaller than it is in this game is if the map was just a flat, empty, wide open space. And they're basically trying to get as close to that as they can, because like I said, in a way, the exosuits themselves make the map flat because elevation has less and less of an effect on the gameplay. Now, there is still some room for skill to make some difference. Maybe you're better at interpreting data from the minimap, maybe you have better reaction time. But of course, that's why they throw in skill-based matchmaking. You cannot escape the forced equilibrium in Call of Duty. Your skill, your talent, your abilities as a human being will never be rewarded in this game. Now, in Battlefield 4, things were very different than they are now in Hardline. Map control had a lot more to do with the vehicles and the destruction. Power positions could be created and destroyed. It was about adaptation, and it was about understanding the role certain vehicles played and how they could be countered by certain other vehicles and how those other vehicles could be countered by infantry. It was like a giant game of Pokemon where every vehicle was weak against something else but had something that was weak against it. Or maybe like a giant rock, paper, and scissors match, except instead of 3 options you had several dozen. You know what I mean? It was about understanding how certain vehicles determine map control. Like if you played a match of Rush and you're on the attacking team and the attacking team has been given an Amtrac, then the gameplay and all the strategy on both teams is supposed to revolve around that Amtrac. And the attacking team cannot possibly win without a proper Amtrac push. For instance, at the start of a match of Rush on Giants of Karelia, in the Final Stand DLC, the defending team has full impenetrable map control. The attacking team on foot cannot possibly break those fortified and elevated positions. And it comes down to how well can they support an Amtrac push with teamwork, using repair guys and prioritizing killing enemy engineers and having your guys spawn on the Amtrac. Suppressing fire is actually a thing, a very useful tactic, but unsurprisingly that makes for a larger skill gap. And frankly, a lot of people, in my experience, even rank 100s and above, failed to grasp the bigger picture, the overarching strategy and the type of gameplay and gunfights that the developers specifically designed the map and mode to accommodate. And power points mattered a lot less in Battlefield 4 because gun skill mattered a lot more, and a lot of the time it might be that you're just out in a huge wide open field or a skirmish among a bunch of trees and hilly terrain, and you're just in a straight up firefight with a dozen dudes from your team and another dozen from the enemy team, and those kind of situations come down to knowing when to dive behind that little mound of dirt or log that's closest. Managing recoil, headshots mattered. The level of destruction meant that there's always something to clip or head glitch. It meant adapting to the situation in real time. A lot of the time, you and an opponent both had a piece of cover, and your aim in that situation really did make a huge difference. A huge skill gap, knowing when to pop fire, compensating for suppression, suppressing the enemy, healing, reviving, all the creative strategies that a squad could work together to employ. Keeping a squad push from one flag to the other alive, and you and the enemy all see each other, but the question is who can hit who more accurately and faster. These really intense, concentrated pushes that have so much more to do with the collective intelligence of a group or squad than the individual, and the individual's gun skill making such a huge difference, and players' understanding of the bigger picture and how vehicles played into that picture, and that kind of gameplay rewarded skill significantly and consistently, and that made it fun, but it also made it intimidating to weaker players, and it meant weaker players quite often got outplayed. And they got outplayed in ways that they didn't understand, right? That's what really turns people off, is when they get wrecked and they don't understand what they could have done differently. And so because of that, destruction, most vehicles, and for the most part 32v32 matches in general, have been taken out of Hardline. I mean, you only have, I think, one game mode that supports 32v32. And they made these decisions because it compresses the skill gap. Destruction in Hardline rarely has an actual effect on the gameplay. I consider it mostly cinematic. Like, it makes it feel intense when shit's blowing up and crumbling, but it can't actually be utilized in a strategic way, especially because you never know which shit will be destructible and which won't. Like on Dust Bowl, some walls and some houses will crumble, others won't, and I can't help but think that's because they know which walls will have an effect on the gameplay if they're blown out, and so they make those ones indestructible. And on top of that, what many of you Hardline players may not have realized yet is that Hardline has actually compressed the shit out of the gunfighting skill gap, because not only is the TTK lower, but they have this obnoxious flinch system where everyone's flinch is random. Regardless of what gun or how far away you get shot, your flinch will be totally random. So if you and an enemy player see each other at roughly the same time and shoot at one another, it's absolutely random who wins that gunfight, because what it really comes down to is who got the shittier flinch, and I hate that shit. So at this point, both games have had their skill gaps compressed relative to their predecessors to a point at which the thing that matters most is who saw who first. It's no longer about gun skill, it's no longer about employing creative strategies and taking advantage of useful tactics based on what mechanics are available to you in game. It's mostly just a big-ass game of hide and seek. But even then, some people are still much better at hide and seek than others, because like we were talking about, the final skill-based dynamic outside of tactical positioning is understanding map flow, understanding how to find people first, knowing where to look for them and when, where they're going to spawn, where they might decide to go. But Call of Duty Ghosts figured out how to destroy that last bastion of skill-based gameplay, and to an extent, both Advanced Warfare and Battlefield Hardline have actually copied the most hated game in the history of COD and implemented a similar formula. Now, disclaimer, this is somewhat speculative. This is only based off of my observation of present video games compared to my observation of past games built on the extensive, ridiculously excessive amount of time I've spent with every shooter that's come out in the last 5 years. But I want to try and highlight, to the best of my ability, the most fucking obnoxious, lazy, and sinister thing that FPS games are doing right now to force equilibrium and crush the last little bit of skill gap that exists in these types of video games. Every FPS player with any self-respect should be deeply concerned about the growing trend that is evident in the multiplayer maps we've been playing over the course of the last 18 months. Most shooters you've played up until very recently used a system of laning, right? Which means designing the type of flow a developer would like to see on a map. Most shooters you've played up until very recently use a system of laning, right? Which means designing the type of flow a developer would like to see on a map. Flow, I typically define as the rate and consistency at which you are getting into gunfights. Now again, when game developers design multiplayer maps, they have an idea of the kind of gunfights and combat scenarios they want to see, right? They know how much player traffic they want to see flowing in what direction. The whole point to lanes in multiplayer maps is setting up choke points and flanking routes to determine what kind of fights a player gets to experience on that particular map. And it's important that they use laning to design these maps with different kinds of flow in order to make sure that each map is offering a unique set of experiences, a unique set of combat scenarios and gunfights. Otherwise, there's no point to having more than one map. Now, Ghosts first coined this anti-laning skill gap compression map layout strategy by putting in so many lanes, going in so many different directions with so many various flanking routes on such large maps that when combined with the random nature of COD spawning system made it impossible for any single player to predict map flow or enemy positions with any consistency. Think back a year. Recall, if you can, maps like Tremor or Chasm. These maps were mazes stacked on top of other mazes. Even in objective game modes, there was no way for even an experienced player to consistently predict what direction an enemy was or what route they might take. You and an enemy could be 5 feet away from each other for the entire match and not even know it, and the result was that it was mostly random who ended up seeing who first, regardless of anyone's skill level. And because seeing someone was, and still is, effectively the hardest part of killing them, it meant that it was entirely random who killed who first. Skill played little to no role in the outcome of gunfights and entire matches. Now, as I've argued in the past, part of the reason Ghost was received so poorly is because people sort of instinctively recognized the fucking disjointed, unpredictable, frustrating, and chaotic map layouts. People didn't like that. They didn't know how to find other people. And people really didn't like how much this type of map scheme slowed down the overall pace of every match. Now, Advanced Warfare implemented a similar formula in a more effective way. Advanced Warfare maps have lanes. They're actually pretty similar to the Black Ops 2 maps, 3-lane systems we saw, but the exosuits themselves negate any effect the lanes might have. The whole point to a lane, again, is directing flow. But with the exosuit, it's impossible to direct flow consistently because whereas in Black Ops, if you're in any given lane, there's usually 2 directions you can go. In Advanced Warfare lanes, you can go any direction at any time. And the result is that the gameplay itself is very similar to the kind of gameplay you would see if every map were just a flat, wide open parking lot. There's no structure to the battle. There aren't really any meaningful strategies that can be developed based on the map layout. There aren't choke points or power points. There's no rushing enemy positions or defending your own position. It just comes down to exo-thrusting around the map and trying to find bad guys before they find you. It's just a silly game of hide and seek. And Battlefield Hardline has also implemented the same formula, and unfortunately in a much more similar way to how Ghost did it. The D-laned clusterfuck map scheme that we saw in Ghosts, though not as universal throughout every map, is still employed to my great frustration in key sections of Battlefield Hardline maps. And I wanted to show you a few brief clips of me touring some of these areas so you understand what I'm talking about. This is the mansion on Hollywood Heights. This is actually a very small map. It's almost as small as a COD map, and they put 32v32 Conquest on this map, and the vast majority of the fighting on this map is going to take place in this mansion. And just look at the lines of sight. You can get shot from any direction at any time. Look at the excessive amount of nooks and crannies. Little places enemies can hide. Little places they could be right in front of you and you can't tell unless you spend a ridiculous amount of time checking every single corner. But if you spend that much time checking corners, you're going to get shot from behind. I guarantee it, because I've tried before. There's no consistent way to effectively check corners in this building. And because of that, there's no way to consistently defend yourself in this building. You don't know what direction the enemy could be coming. It's impossible to predict. They can come through this window, over this wall, up that staircase, in through the ceiling. There's no way to know where anyone is ever, because even if you see them spotted on the minimap, because there's like 4 different stories to this building, so they could be above or below you, and this building can fit like 4 separate little nook and cranny hiding space closet fucking things into the mini-map space of 1 orange triangle. Footsteps are useless because at any given time there's a dozen bad guys and a dozen good guys running every which way all around you. When you come into this building, regardless of your skill level, you are pulling the lever on a slot machine to determine if you will see someone before you are seen. That's all it comes down to, and nobody survives in this building longer than a minute. If a weak player and a stronger player walk into this building at the same time, it is almost 50-50 who kills who. Not exactly 50-50. I think the strong player probably still has some edge, but it's as close as 50-50 as they can make it, because really the only strategic option available to each player is to explore the maze and cover as much ground as possible. Unless they have some evidence, some vague idea of where their opponent is, they're forced to just guess which route to explore first, and at that point it's random who made the better guess. And the more random things become, the less skill matters. If you roll the dice well, it's not because you were talented, it's because random worked out for you. 2 people could sit there flipping a coin to decide who's more awesome, but the outcome would be entirely irrelevant of skill because it's just fucking random. And that's what this area comes down to. And basically every map in Hardline has an area like this, and it's usually the most high traffic or important area on the map. For instance, the center flag on Riptide has this same shit going on. It's the same mansion with this just clusterfuck of lanes and lines of sight. This is the most high traffic flag on the map. Alright, the entire Grow House map, the entire map layout of the block, it's specifically designed to be these randomized clusterfucks that disproportionately benefits noobs, kills per minute, and waters down the overall experience for everyone, period. So both Advanced Warfare and Battlefield Hardline have implemented very similar forced equilibrium formulas, but were received very differently by their respective communities relative to their respective predecessors. Almost everyone likes Advanced Warfare more than Ghosts, but Hardline frankly stumbled. And it's not a matter of opinion. The fact that Hardline's release date had to be delayed, the fact that they are continuing to release free DLC guns for Battlefield 4 even after Hardline is out, tells us that as a successor, Hardline stumbled. It's not a terrible game, it's certainly not as dumbed down as Advanced Warfare or any COD, for that matter, besides maybe COD 4 and World at War. It's certainly not as dumbed down as Advanced Warfare. And I think Hardline has a lot more to offer in terms of the depth and its gameplay experiences. Hardline is a better game than Advanced Warfare. But the reason it wasn't received as well relative to its predecessor when compared to Advanced Warfare and its predecessor is because the Battlefield community and the player base is much better at recognizing bullshit when they see it. The Battlefield community for the most part, recognized that Hardline was a watered-down Battlefield experience, and I think most of the Battlefield fanbase knew why it was watered down, to appeal to COD players, and they rejected it. Whereas the COD player base loves their drug, they love their magic show, and very few of us realize what a pathetic and fake experience it really is. The best COD players I know suck cock at almost every other FPS out there, not because they can't be good FPS players, but because they've never had to be. And because of that, they stay on COD and reject any game that makes them try, that makes them work to be better, to actually accomplish something. And that's the only reason COD hasn't been beaten out by any of the, dozen superior shooter titles to come out while it was on top. Not because Call of Duty is a strong game, but because it has made its fan base weak. Period. And I criticize the COD community as a member of it. I've bought every Call of Duty since, COD 3. I've played each one extensively. I guarantee you I've put more money and time into the Call of Duty franchise than the vast majority of you. I had 45 days played on MW2. And I remember not liking other games because I couldn't do as well on them as often. I remember going from COD to Halo Reach and getting wrecked and wishing the game was more like COD. I remember getting on Battlefield 3 and getting absolutely wrecked and wishing the game was more like COD. Do not pray, as I know so many of you have, for every game to be more like Call of Duty. Pray to be a better FPS player. I remember finally feeling like I had mastered COD. On Black Ops 2, I remember finally having what I considered a perfect combat record that I had been chasing for several COD games in a row, always coming up short in some area, but then finally achieving the full validation of my own ego. And why did I need that self-validation? And more importantly, why was it so important to me that other people could witness the accomplishment, that I could show them the combat record, that we can all show people what achievements and trophies we've gotten in what games, and leaderboards and gamer scores, on a game that will be entirely forgotten and completely irrelevant after its annual successor releases less than a year after you attained whatever it is you wanted to show off? Is it because modern society cuts off any access we have to real-life accomplishment for the first 18 years of our life? Is it because we spend the first 18 years of our life in a simulator called school that ultimately simulates nothing, that develops no real-world applicable skills or talents, that didn't even teach me how to do my taxes or cook my own food or open my own bank account? Is it because we're not allowed out of that simulator, there is no time or oxygen to pursue any activity other than the simulator, and it's illegal for us to work or make our own decisions, and we are not yet eligible to manage our own finances, we are less than people for those first 18 years, we are literally and legally property to the parents who birthed us without my permission, and our egos are defined by arbitrary letters that only measure our ability to hear our glorified babysitter say something and repeat it back to them and pretend that's learning, that will never be applied in any way except passing that ultimate symbol of human incompetence that we call a test, with every study and bit of research out there proving irrefutably that most of what we learn for the test we forget immediately after the test? Is it because at the age of 16, I and so many others internalized the D's and C's on our report cards and instinctively feared that we had no real value to the rest of society, that from an evolutionary standpoint we may not be worth the resources the herd allocates, and if that much is recognized we will be left to die? Call of Duty was a shield and a hospital and a safe place for rehabilitation for a generation of young men like me, like you, who grew up without any outlet to prove their self-worth to both the world and, more importantly, ourselves. Call of Duty, with its flaws, with the rage that accompanied it, brought me through one of the darkest periods of my life, a time when I saw no point to the present, when I hated being at school and I was relieved to go home, but I hated being at home and I was relieved to go to school, when I was disappointed every time I woke up because at least in my dreams I was free, when I even felt guilty for feeling miserable because culture told me these were first world problems and I should be thankful for my cage and the simulator, when I took no joy in anything, when I was ditching school so often that the district threatened to have my mom arrested, when I was showing up every day only so she wouldn't go to jail, when I did the schoolwork only because if I didn't they would hold me back and I'd be in the same position all over again, when I didn't understand why it was so hard for me to toe the line the same way as everybody else, when I hated myself because I couldn't. Call of Duty was an escape, because puberty in this century, age 13 to 18, is fucking miserable. A century ago, 2 centuries ago, 13 to 18, you're a grown man, you're a fucking adult, you're about to die. Nowadays, 13 to 18, we got the worst of both worlds. We got the worst of being a child and the worst of being an adult. We have urges we can't control, and we have no freedom to deal with them on our own accord. Call of Duty was an escape. For me, as it was for so many of you, as are all video games and books and television and movies and whatever other distractions we seek, whether at the bottom of a bottle or the crispy embers of a hot pipe. But more than an escape, it was a self-confidence boost, as I know it was for so many of you, even if it sounds too silly to admit. It brought my spirits up and gave me something to distract myself when nothing else would. It nurtured and restored a level of vitality to an ego that had wilted without sun for years. And I'll always be grateful for that. And I don't want COD to be on top anymore because I don't want other games to follow its lead, but I'll never call for Call of Duty's death, because I know there are other kids out there right now who still need that validation, even if it is artificial. But there inevitably comes a time when the illusion can no longer be maintained, nor should it be. There comes a time for growing up. After achieving that perfect combat record, I was bored, and it dawned on me that it had all been an ego-driven experience, and that without nothing left to chase, there was no fun left to be had. I mean, I could have chased the 3 KD, but then I'd have to play more defensively and use higher kill streaks, which would sacrifice the SPM and probably the win-loss, which was the hardest stat to keep positive. Content with achieving the goals I had set for myself, the game became hollow, it lost its meaning. I would play a match, and if I did well, it made no difference, because without the overarching set of goals, the gameplay itself became repetitive and monotonous, because that's what happens when a game is overly simplistic. That's how COD has to be, so that everyone can use it to soothe their own egos, because that's what's being sold. Not a game, but a psychological crutch. Self-validation of the ego, a self-confidence boost, antidepressants, drugs. So I gave other games a go, like Reach, like Battlefield 3, not because I needed more ego validation, because I didn't. I'd escaped the simulator, I had my own place, I had a girlfriend, and that warm, fuzzy feeling I call freedom. I gave other games a try because I loved video games, because they were fun, they are my hobby. And it's different once you start treating them like a hobby, as a source of entertainment, and not as a drug, which is what Call of Duty has always been, and it's what draws so many people to it, even if they don't realize it. And of course, usually they don't, because if they did, it wouldn't work. When you judge it as an actual source of entertainment, as you begin to see games appeal based on their experiences, the novelty of trying something new, how much more fun and interesting those things are simply because you haven't tried them before, in this game or some other game, when you understand that the more difficult the challenge is, the more rewarding it is to overcome. I fell in love with Battlefield for these reasons. Fell in love with Halo. I have learned to love video games in a way that we all forgot for a while when we got drunk on the Kool-Aid that is Call of Duty. Battlefield can try to copy COD as they have with Hardline, but the best they'll ever be is a bridge or a runner-up. Hardline's unenthusiastic reception is a result of both EA and Visceral misunderstanding the fundamental appeal of both Battlefield and Call of Duty. They've learned that the hard way, and if they try this again with Battlefront or some future Battlefield, it's not because it's the best strategy financially, it's only because they are stupid. If you came to me with $60 and you said, Batman, should I buy Hardline or Advanced Warfare? I would tell you to buy Battlefield 4. Because gaming should be about more than sugar highs and magic tricks. It should be about pushing human creativity to its limits, building battlefields, not playgrounds. The For the Win query of the day is, what is your best memory on a Battlefield game, and what is your best memory on a Call of Duty game, and which memory do you enjoy more? Please remember to rate the video. This is Batman signing out. Holy shit.